You walk into the town square on a Tuesday morning. Yesterday, people greeted you. The shopkeepers smiled. Neighbors stopped to chat. Children played near your home without fear. But today, everything is different. A woman sees you coming and crosses to the other side of the street. A man who borrowed tools from you last week turns his back and walks away. You approach the bakery where you have bought bread for 5 years, and the baker shakes his head. He will not serve you anymore. You have not committed a crime. You have not wronged anyone, but overnight you have become untouchable. Your children come home from school crying because other children have been told not to play with them. Your wife goes to the market and women whisper and point. You have not changed. You are the same person you were yesterday, but you accepted a job, and that job has marked you. Society needs what you do, but it will never forgive you for doing it. This was the harsh reality in medieval and early modern Europe, spanning roughly from the 1300s through the 1800s, a time when certain professions were considered so degrading or spiritually contaminating that anyone who performed them was cast out of normal society. These were not just unpleasant jobs. They were roles that carried social death. The work itself was legal and often necessary, but the people who did it were classified as dishonorable, a formal status that stripped them of basic rights and social standing. They could not join guilds. They could not hold public office. They were barred from testifying in court. Their children inherited the stigma and faced the same restrictions. One of the most despised occupations was that of the town crier or bellman, who also served as the public shame enforcer. But even more universally hated was the job of the skinner or flayer, the person responsible for removing and processing the hides of dead animals, particularly horses and other large livestock. Every town needed someone to handle carcasses, extract usable materials, and prevent disease from rotting animals. But the work involved death, blood, and decay, and society decided that anyone who touched dead animals was fundamentally unclean and unfit for normal human interaction. His name was Willem. He was 28 years old and lived in a mid-sized town in the Netherlands. He had been a leather worker, a respectable trade, working in a small shop with his father. But his father died suddenly, and Willem discovered the shop was deep in debt. Creditors seized everything. Willem had a wife and infant son and no means to support them. He searched for work but found nothing. Leather guilds would not accept him without money for membership fees. Other trades were closed to him. Then the town skinner died. The position had been vacant for 2 weeks and animal carcasses were piling up. The town council was desperate. They offered the job to Willem. The pay was steady, better than most manual labor, and came with a small house on the outskirts of town. Willem asked why the pay was so high if the job was just handling dead animals. The councilman looked at him and said he would understand soon enough. Willem had no other options. He accepted. The job began immediately. Willem was taken to the skinner's yard, a fenced area far from the town center. The smell hit him before he saw it. Rotting flesh, dried blood, and decay mixed into something overwhelming. Several dead horses were already there, brought by farmers whose animals had died. Willem's job was to process them. First, he had to skin the animal, carefully removing the hide because it could be sold to tanners. Then he butchered the carcass, separating usable parts. Bones could be sold for glue and fertilizer. Fat was rendered for tallow. Hooves and certain organs had industrial uses. Nothing was wasted, but everything involved cutting into dead, often decomposing flesh. Willem spent his first day skinning a horse that had been dead for 3 days in summer heat. The flesh was bloated and slipping. Maggots were everywhere. He vomited repeatedly but forced himself to continue. By the end of the day, he was covered in blood, fluids, and filth. The smell had soaked into his skin and clothes. He could not wash it off no matter how hard he tried. Willem worked alone. No one would help him. No one would even come near the yard. Dead animals were left outside the gate, and owners walked away quickly without speaking. Willem would drag the carcasses inside and begin the gruesome process of breaking them down. The work was physically brutal. Large animals were heavy and difficult to maneuver. Cutting through thick hide and muscle required constant force. His hands were perpetually covered in cuts and blisters. His back ached from bending and hauling. The tools were simple and crude. Sharp knives, bone saws, hooks, and chains. Every day brought new carcasses. Horses, cows, pigs, dogs. Some had died from disease, some from injury. Some were so decomposed he could barely touch them without the flesh falling apart. But he had no choice. This was his job now. This was how he fed his family. The social destruction happened immediately. Within days of accepting the position, Willem was completely isolated. People he had known his entire life would not look at him. The baker refused to sell to him. The butcher turned him away. Other shopkeepers closed their doors when they saw him coming. His wife had to do all the shopping, and even now she was treated differently now. Women she had been friendly with stopped talking to her. She was invited to no gatherings. Willem's son was too young to understand yet, but Willem knew what was coming. The boy would grow up marked by his father's occupation. He would be excluded from schools, apprenticeships, and normal social life. Willem had not just condemned himself. He had condemned his entire family. Willem tried to attend church, but the congregation made it clear he was not welcome. People moved away when he sat down. The priest gave him cold, disapproving looks. After a few weeks, Willem stopped going. He was told that Skinners were not permitted to be buried in consecrated ground when they died. His body would be thrown into an unmarked pit outside the cemetery walls. He was spiritually contaminated, and the church had formally recognized it. Willem felt his humanity slipping away. He was no longer a person with a name and a history. He was just the Skinner, the man who touched death. And society made sure he never forgot it. Think about this. Imagine doing essential work that prevents disease and provides valuable materials, but being treated like you are cursed for doing it. Imagine your children being punished for your job, excluded and shamed for something they had no control over. Could you live with that? And what does it say about a society that needs certain work but destroys the people who perform it? The work carried constant physical danger. Dead animals often carried diseases. Anthrax, rabies, and various infections could spread through cuts and contact. Willem had no gloves, no protective equipment, just his bare hands and basic tools. He cut himself almost daily while skinning and butchering. Every cut was a potential entry point for deadly infection. He developed sores on his hands and arms that would not heal. He had chronic respiratory problems from breathing in the stench and particles from rotting flesh. Once, he processed a cow that had died from anthrax. He did not know it was infected until he developed painful lesions on his arms and a high fever. He nearly died. No doctor came to treat him. His wife cared for him as best she could, and he survived through sheer luck. But he was back at work within days because there was no one to replace him, and the town needed the dead animals removed. One incident broke something in Willem. A farmer brought a horse that had been his companion for over 20 years. The man was openly grieving, tears running down his face. He asked Willem to treat the animal with respect. Willem nodded and promised he would. The farmer left, and Willem stared at the dead horse. Respect meant nothing here. This was just another carcass to be broken down into parts and sold. Willem skinned the horse. He cut away the flesh. He boiled the bones. By the end of the day, the animal that had been a man's beloved friend for 2 decades was reduced to a pile of hides, bones, and rendered fat. Willem sat in the yard that evening, covered in blood, and realized he had stopped feeling anything. The work had numbed him completely. But here is what makes this even darker. Skinners were legally prohibited from living inside town limits. They had to reside in the Skinner's house, which was always located outside the walls or at the very edge of the settlement. They were forbidden from using the same wells as other citizens. In some regions, they had to wear specific clothing or badges that identified them in public. They were legally classified as dishonorable, and that status was inherited. Willem's son would be a Skinner's son for his entire life, even if he never touched a dead animal. The stigma was permanent and generational. Willem had not just destroyed his own life. He had destroyed his bloodline. Now think about this. We still have jobs that society needs but refuses to honor: slaughterhouse workers, sanitation workers, morticians, people who handle the uncomfortable necessities that keep civilization functioning. We pay them, but we do not respect them. We depend on them, but we do not want to think about them. Has anything really changed? Most skinners did not last more than 10 or 15 years before the combination of disease, injury, and psychological isolation destroyed them. Willem lasted 7 years. By the time he was 35, he was a broken man. His body was scarred and weakened from repeated infections. His hands were deformed from constant cutting and exposure to caustic chemicals used in processing. His lungs were damaged, but worse than the physical damage was the psychological destruction. He barely spoke anymore. He had retreated so far into himself that he was almost unreachable. His wife stayed with him out of obligation, and because she had nowhere else to go, but their relationship was hollow. They lived together but barely interacted. Willem's end came during a harsh winter. He was processing a frozen horse carcass, struggling to cut through the ice-hard flesh. His knife slipped and plunged deep into his thigh, severing a major blood vessel. Blood poured onto the snow. He tried to stop the bleeding, but his hands were too numb from cold. He managed to stumble toward his house, leaving a trail of blood behind him. His wife found him collapsed outside the door. She tried to save him, but there was too much blood. Willem died in her arms, silent and alone, his last moments as isolated as the rest of his life had been. The town buried him outside the cemetery walls in an unmarked grave. The town council hired another desperate man to take his place. The work never stopped. Society needed people like Willem to maintain public health and extract valuable resources from dead animals. Without skinners, carcasses would rot in streets and fields, spreading plague and contaminating water supplies. The hides, bones, and other materials they processed were essential to multiple industries. Willem provided all of that, but society repaid him with exile, contempt, and social death. He was useful but unforgivable, necessary but despised. There were thousands of skinners across Europe. Most died young, isolated, and forgotten. Their work kept towns functioning, but they were never acknowledged as contributors. They were just untouchables, people to be used and discarded. The occupation eventually faded as industrialization centralized animal processing, but the stigma lasted for generations. Families descended from skinners carried the dishonorable label well into the modern era. Willem's son grew up marked and excluded. He never escaped his father's shadow. Willem had sacrificed everything to keep his family alive, and the reward was permanent social exile for himself and his descendants. Willem is gone now. The skinner's yard where he worked has been built over. The town that used him and cast him out has forgotten he ever existed. But the dynamic remains. Society still creates jobs it considers degrading. It still needs people to do work it refuses to honor. Willem did that work. He was an ordinary man who became an outcast the moment he accepted a job his community needed but could not respect. And if you think being a skinner was the most socially destructive job in history, there were others. Jobs that isolated people even more completely. Jobs that not only exiled workers from society, but erased entire families from history. And some of those patterns still exist today, hidden behind different names and modern systems.